Welcome to Hot Topic TV, where we bring you controversial stories that challenge perspectives and stir conversation. If you enjoy thought-provoking content, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a crisp morning at the prestigious Hampton International Conference Center, where the world's most influential leaders, business moguls, and politicians gathered for an annual gala. The venue, known for its opulence and exclusivity, was buzzing with activity. Elegantly dressed guests exchanged pleasantries. Champagne glasses clinked, and the scent of high-end perfumes wafted through the air. The ballroom sparkled under the light of massive chandeliers, casting an ethereal glow on the wealthy elite. This event was not just any social gathering. It was a place where power met opportunity, where alliances were formed and broken over delicate hors d'oeuvres and polished conversation. Among the glittering crowd, a black woman entered the room. She wore a simple, yet elegant black dress that accentuated her poised demeanor. Her natural curls framed her face, giving her a striking appearance that made her stand out, though not in the way she expected. The hum of the room barely faltered as she made her way through the sea of well-dressed attendees. Most of them didn't even bother to look at her. She was invisible to them. The very people who prided themselves on their worldly views and progressive values couldn't see past their deeply ingrained biases. She wasn't just any woman. This was Ava Monroe, one of the most successful businesswomen in the world, though few at the gala would recognize her on sight. Ava had built a billion-dollar empire through hard work, intelligence, and perseverance. She was a quiet force in the business world, preferring to let her actions speak louder than her presence. But tonight, that quiet presence would be her undoing, or so it seemed. As Ava moved further into the room, one of the event organizers, a tall, middle-aged white woman named Mrs. Fitzpatrick, caught sight of her. Mrs. Fitzpatrick was impeccably dressed, her sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure everything was perfect for the evening. When her gaze landed on Ava, her expression immediately changed from one of professional neutrality to barely concealed disdain. In her mind, Ava didn't belong here. She assumed, without hesitation, that this black woman in the midst of the elite must be one of the staff, perhaps a server or someone from the cleaning crew who had wandered in. Without waiting for confirmation, Mrs. Fitzpatrick strode over to Ava, her heels clicking with authority on the polished marble floor. She stopped just inches away from Ava, her eyes narrowing in on her as though she had caught an intruder. "Excuse me," Mrs. Fitzpatrick said, her voice curt and laced with irritation. "What are you doing here? You should be in the back with the other staff." Ava turned her head slightly, her face remaining calm and composed despite the insult. She was used to this. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, that someone mistook her for someone lesser, someone undeserving of the space she occupied. She had encountered similar microaggressions throughout her career, but each one still stung in its own way. Mrs. Fitzpatrick continued, oblivious to Ava's silent composure. "You know, this area is reserved for guests. We can't have the staff mingling with the attendees. It's unprofessional." Ava remained silent, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Fitzpatrick's. The power dynamics of the situation were apparent. Mrs. Fitzpatrick stood there, confident in her assumptions, while Ava quietly absorbed the insult. Around them, other guests had begun to take notice. Whispers spread like wildfire, people turning their heads slightly to catch a glimpse of the confrontation. But no one intervened. No one ever did. As the tension grew, a young assistant approached Mrs. Fitzpatrick, handing her an updated list of the VIP guests for the evening. Mrs. Fitzpatrick glanced at the list without much thought, until her eyes caught something that made her pause. Her face paled slightly, her fingers gripping the paper a little tighter. There, near the top of the list, was a name she knew all too well. Ava Monroe, CEO of Monroe Global Enterprises. Her company had been featured in Forbes, Fortune, and nearly every major business publication for its innovation and philanthropy. Ava wasn't just any businesswoman, she was one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the world. And here she was, standing right in front of Mrs. Fitzpatrick, who had just publicly humiliated her. Mrs. Fitzpatrick's face turned a shade whiter as the realization sunk in. She had not only insulted one of the most important guests at the gala, but also one of the most powerful women in the business world. She stammered, trying to find the words to fix what she had done. "Oh, Miss Monroe, I am so sorry I didn't recognize you," Mrs. Fitzpatrick said, her voice shaking slightly. The confident authority she had just moments ago was gone, replaced by a nervous, stuttering apology. "Please forgive me. I had no idea." Ava smiled, but it wasn't a smile of malice. It was a knowing smile, one that spoke of years of experience in dealing with situations like this. She could have easily called out Mrs. Fitzpatrick for her behavior, could have made a scene that would humiliate her in return. But that wasn't who Ava was. "It happens more often than you think," Ava said calmly, her voice steady and measured. "But I've learned to rise above it." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated throughout the room. People had stopped their conversations to listen, some in disbelief, others in quiet shame. The whispers grew louder as more guests learned of who Ava was, and the irony of the situation began to sink in. Mrs. Fitzpatrick tried to stammer out another apology, but Ava had already turned her attention elsewhere. She didn't need the validation of these people, nor did she need to engage in their hollow attempts at redemption. She had spent her entire life proving that she belonged in spaces like this, not by seeking their approval, but by owning her success. As the night went on, word spread throughout the room about Ava's identity, and the atmosphere shifted. People who had previously ignored her or assumed she was a staff member now sought her out, eager to introduce themselves and make connections. But Ava wasn't interested in their belated recognition. She knew that their sudden interest had nothing to do with her as a person, but everything to do with her status and wealth. Later that night, as Ava made her way to the exit, she reflected on the evening's events. She had attended this gala not to make a point, but to support a cause she deeply believed in. But once again, she had been forced into a position where her worth was judged not by her accomplishments, but by the color of her skin. The next morning, headlines across major news outlets read, "Billionaire Ava Monroe faces racism at elite gala." The story went viral, sparking widespread conversation about the pervasive nature of racism, even in spaces that claim to be inclusive. Social media exploded with discussions about implicit bias, the treatment of Black women in positions of power, and the need for systemic change. Ava, however, continued on as she always had, focused, determined, and unbothered by the noise. She knew that her true power lay not in the recognition of others, but in her unwavering sense of self. And that, my friends, is the power of Ava Monroe, a woman who not only built an empire but carries herself with a strength that outshines any prejudice thrown her way. Let this story be a reminder that assumptions, especially those based on skin color, can blind us to the greatness standing right in front of us. If you enjoyed this story and want more controversial, eye-opening content, don't forget to subscribe to Hot Topic TV and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. We're here to challenge perspectives and open minds, one story at a time.